The cold wind cut through the streets as Amelia pulled her tattered coat tighter around her small frame. At just 8 years old, she had learned that hunger was a constant companion, gnawing at her insides with relentless cruelty. Her bare feet, dirt, streaked and bruised, moved hesitantly over the pavement as she approached the bright lights of an upscale restaurant. The golden glow from the large windows cast long shadows on the street, making her feel even smaller, even less significant. She hesitated at the entrance, her heart hammering against her ribs. The aroma of freshly baked bread and rich, savory meats filled her nostrils, making her stomach clench painfully. She swallowed, forcing down her fear. Tonight, she had no choice. She hadn't eaten in days. If she didn't find food, the weakness that had been creeping through her limbs would soon consume her entirely. Summoning every ounce of courage, Amelia pushed open the glass door and stepped inside. The warmth hit her like a wave, but so did the stares. Conversations halted. Forks paused mid-air. The soft clinking of glasses faded into a heavy silence. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward her, taking in the ragged dress, the dirt, smudged face, the trembling hands clutching her stomach. She could feel their judgment like daggers against her skin. She kept her gaze down, shuffling forward on shaky legs. The restaurant was grand. Gleaming chandeliers, velvet chairs, polished wooden floors. The kind of place where people like her didn't belong. Her voice came out small, barely a whisper. "Please, can someone spare a little food? I—" A man in a tailored suit sitting nearby wrinkled his nose. "Get her out of here," he muttered to no one in particular. A woman in an elegant dress turned her gaze away, setting down her wineglass with an air of practiced indifference. Amelia swallowed the lump rising in her throat. "Please, just a piece of bread." Her plea was met with silence. A few diners exchanged awkward glances. Some pretended not to see her at all. Then came the voice, sharp, impatient. "This is no place for beggars." Amelia flinched as the restaurant owner strode toward her. He was a tall, broad-shouldered man with a permanent scowl etched into his face. His expensive watch glinted under the chandelier light as he stopped in front of her, arms crossed. "You think the customers want to see this while they eat?" He gestured at her, as though she were nothing more than filth on the floor. "Out. Now." She tried to hold her ground, but her legs were weak, her body unsteady. "Sir, I just need something to eat. Just a little." His face hardened. "No one owes you anything, girl." He took a step forward, his towering frame swallowing hers. Her instinct screamed at her to run, but her stomach begged her to stay. "Out, before I drag you out myself," he snapped. A few diners chuckled under their breath. Others returned to their meals, satisfied that the problem was being dealt with. No one spoke for her. No one stood up. Her throat burned, but she refused to cry. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. Slowly, she took a step back, then another. Her head bowed, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The shame pressed down on her, heavy and suffocating.
She turned toward the door, her vision blurring.
Then, just as she reached the exit, something hit her. A sudden force from the side, sharp and deliberate. The tray of steaming soup crashed onto her chest, the scalding liquid soaking into her dress. The impact knocked her back a step, her breath catching in her throat. A gasp rippled through the restaurant, but no one moved to help. Amelia's skin burned where the soup had seeped through, but worse was the humiliation. "Oh dear," a voice cooed, mockingly sweet.
She looked up to see a waitress standing over her, a smirk barely concealed on her lips. A tall, elegant woman with perfectly styled hair and cold, calculating eyes. She tilted her head, pretending concern. "How clumsy of me."
Laughter spread through the restaurant, some discreet, others cruel and open. Amelia's heart pounded. The soup dripped from her arms, soaking into the already tattered fabric of her dress. The sting of the heat was nothing compared to the crushing weight of the moment. She could hear them whispering, "She's pathetic. What a spectacle. Someone should charge admission." Her knees buckled, but she caught herself. She would not fall. She would not break. Then, from the corner of her eye, she saw it. A small, wilted piece of potato, part of the spilled soup, resting on the polished floor. Her stomach twisted in agony. Hunger drowned out her pride. Before she could stop herself, she dropped to her knees. Her fingers, thin and shaking, reached out for the potato. A cruel snicker echoed above her. "Would you look at that?" Another burst of laughter. But she didn't care. She grabbed the tiny morsel, fingers curling around it like a treasure.
She brought it to her lips.
A swift movement. A broom swept the potato away. Amelia gasped, watching it vanish into the dustpan. She looked up, eyes burning. The waitress stood over her, the broom still in her hand, her smile widening. "I told you," she said softly, so only Amelia could hear. "This is no place for people like you." Amelia's hands curled into fists, her nails digging into her palms. A sharp pain bloomed in her chest, but she forced herself to her feet. "I'm leaving," she murmured.
She turned without another word, shoulders squared, but she could still hear them.
The laughter, the whispers, the murmured insults. She pushed open the door and stepped into the night. The cold hit her immediately, sharp and unkind. Then she ran. Her feet pounded against the pavement as she fled, the humiliation burning hotter than the soup had. She ran until her legs gave out, collapsing onto the hard stone of the town square. Curling into herself, she let the tears fall, silent and bitter.
She stared up at the dark sky, her breaths uneven.
"They don't understand," she whispered. "They'll never understand."
She didn't know how long she lay there before she heard the footsteps.
Soft, small, hesitant. A little girl knelt beside her, her curls bouncing slightly in the breeze. She couldn't have been older than 6. Amelia blinked at her, unsure. The girl hesitated, glancing around nervously. Then, slowly, she uncurled her tiny fingers. A piece of bread rested in her palm. Amelia's breath caught. "I couldn't finish it," the girl whispered, her voice barely audible. "You can have it." For the first time that night, something other than pain welled up inside Amelia.
She took the bread, hands trembling. She wanted to say thank you.
But her throat closed, and the words wouldn't come. The little girl smiled shyly, then ran back toward the restaurant, disappearing into the glow of its lights. Amelia stared down at the bread in her hands. A tiny, fragile kindness. Her fingers tightened around it.
She had no idea that this single act of compassion would change everything.
The stone pavement of the town square was cold beneath Amelia as she sat curled up against a worn-out bench, her knees drawn to her chest. The tiny piece of bread, a gift from the little girl, had been divided among the other street children who shared her fate. The hunger still gnawed at her, but there was warmth in her heart, something she hadn't felt in a long time. Someone had cared, even if only for a moment. She looked around at the world that continued without her. Businessmen hurried past, their leather shoes clicking against the pavement. Women in elegant coats carried shopping bags filled with more than she could dream of owning. They all moved as if she were invisible. Her stomach clenched painfully, but she had learned long ago that hunger was not enough to stop the world from spinning. A heavy sigh drew her attention. Across the square, a man stood by a lamppost, his head bowed. He was tall, dressed in an expensive overcoat, but there was something about him, something wary.
His shoulders slumped, and his hands trembled slightly as he pinched the bridge of his nose.
Nathan Sterling. She had heard the name before, a millionaire, a powerful businessman. Amelia tilted her head, watching him curiously. How could a man who had everything look so... Nathan exhaled sharply and pulled out his phone, barely paying attention to where he was walking. His steps were slow, unfocused, like a man carrying a weight that even his wealth couldn't lift. Then she heard it, the roar of an engine. A bus, its headlights piercing through the misty night, barreling down the street at a terrifying speed. And Nathan was walking straight into its path. Amelia's body moved before her mind could catch up. Her legs burned as she sprinted forward, her bare feet slapping against the pavement. The world blurred around her. The only thing in focus was the man who had no idea he was about to die. Her breath came in short gasps as she got closer. He still hadn't looked up. His phone's glow reflected in his eyes, oblivious to the disaster about to unfold. The bus honked, a desperate, blaring warning. Too late. With the last ounce of strength in her tiny body, Amelia threw herself forward, her hands slamming against Nathan's chest. He staggered, caught completely off guard, stumbling backward onto the safety of the sidewalk. She wasn't as lucky. The impact came like a storm. The world tilted violently as the bus's metal frame clipped her side, sending her small body hurtling across the pavement. She hit the ground hard, her head slamming against the curb. A sharp, searing pain exploded through her skull, and then... silence. For the first time in what felt like forever, there was no hunger, no shame, no cruel laughter. Just darkness. Nathan's heart nearly stopped as he turned in time to see the girl's fragile body lying crumpled on the street. The reality of what had just happened crashed into him like a tidal wave. She had saved him. This child, this tiny girl in rags, had risked her life to push him out of the way. People gasped. Murmurs filled the air. Phones were raised, capturing the scene. Nathan didn't care. He dropped to his knees beside her, his pulse thundering in his ears. Hey, stay with me, he choked out, his hands shaking as he gently cradled her head. Blood trickled from a cut on her forehead, staining his fingers. She was so small, so fragile. Panic clawed at his throat. He'd never felt anything like this before. Somebody call an ambulance, he roared, his voice laced with fear. The crowd stood frozen, staring. Nathan gritted his teeth. His entire life had been built on control, on fixing problems with power, with money. But now, none of that mattered. He was powerless. His breath came in ragged gasps as he stared down at the girl who had saved him. She barely moved. Her tiny chest rose and fell in shallow, uneven breaths. "Come on, kid," he whispered. "You can't check out now." A weak sound escaped her lips. Nathan leaned closer, desperate.
What is it? What are you trying to say?
Her eyelids fluttered, her lips parted, the words a fragile whisper. "Don't let them. Go hungry." His chest tightened. "What?" She tried again, each word a struggle. The kids, in the square. Nathan felt something shift inside him, a crack in the walls he had built for so long. She wasn't asking for herself. Even now, even at the edge of consciousness, she was thinking of others. His throat tightened. "I promise," he swore, his voice hoarse. "I swear I'll help them. Just hold on." The distant wail of sirens cut through the night. The ambulance. Relief warred with fear as the paramedics rushed forward, pushing him aside as they assessed the damage. Nathan stood, his hands still trembling. He watched as they placed her onto the stretcher, an oxygen mask pressed to her face. She looked so small against the sea of flashing lights. "Sir," a paramedic called, snapping him back to reality. He almost laughed, injured. The girl lying unconscious on the stretcher had saved his life. And here he was standing, intact, unharmed. "No," he murmured, "not physically." The paramedic nodded before turning away, following the others as they lifted the girl into the ambulance. Nathan hesitated for only a second before moving. He climbed in after them, taking a seat beside the stretcher, his hands curled into fists. He couldn't leave her. Not now. Not after what she had done. As the ambulance doors shut and the vehicle sped off into the night, Nathan Sterling made a silent vow. He didn't know this girl. He didn't know her story. But whatever happened next, whatever it took, he would not let her die. Not after she had given him a second chance at life. The ambulance sped through the streets, its siren cutting through the night. Nathan sat rigid in the corner, his hands gripping the metal railing beside the stretcher where the girl lay unconscious. The flashing red and blue lights illuminated her pale face, her body unnaturally still beneath the thin hospital blanket. "Her pulse is weak," one of the paramedics muttered, adjusting the IV in her frail arm. Nathan clenched his jaw. His heart pounded against his ribs like a drum, an unfamiliar sensation crawling through his chest. Fear. Not the fear of a bad business deal or a market crash. No, this was different. This was real. "Do something," he snapped, his voice harsh, desperate. "We're doing everything we can," the paramedic replied evenly. "But she needs a hospital, fast." Nathan dragged a hand through his hair, forcing himself to breathe. He had never been in a situation where money couldn't immediately fix the problem. But this was a life hanging by a thread. A child's life. The ambulance jerked to a stop, and the back doors flew open. A team of doctors and nurses rushed forward, pulling the stretcher out with swift efficiency. Nathan followed, his long strides matching their hurried pace as they wheeled her through the hospital doors. 8-year-old female pedestrian hit by a vehicle, one of the paramedics reported as they rushed through the halls. Severe head trauma, possible internal bleeding, vitals unstable. Nathan barely registered the words. All he could hear was the sound of her shallow breathing. All he could see was the blood staining the white sheets beneath her. A doctor, a middle-aged man with sharp eyes and a stethoscope hanging around his neck, turned to him. "Are you a relative?" Nathan hesitated. No, he wasn't. He didn't even know her name. But the truth felt wrong, too small, too distant from what had just happened. "Yes," he said firmly, "I'm responsible for her." The doctor nodded, accepting the answer without question. "She's critical. We need to stabilize her, but she'll require surgery. Do you consent to treatment?" "Anything, whatever it takes," Nathan said immediately. "She may not survive the night," the doctor warned, his tone measured but grave. Nathan swallowed the lump in his throat. Just save her. With that, the doctors pushed the stretcher through a set of doors, leaving him alone in the hallway, his pulse racing. He turned abruptly, striding toward the front desk. "I want the best surgeons in this hospital working on her," he told the nurse, his voice sharp with authority. "And if you don't have them, call another hospital. I'll pay for the transfer, the medical team, whatever it takes." The nurse, startled, hesitated. "Sir, we're doing everything we can." "Do more." His voice dropped lower, almost a growl. "Find a way."
She nodded hurriedly and picked up the phone.
Nathan exhaled sharply, dragging a hand down his face. His mind was racing. He had built his empire by fixing problems, by taking control of chaos. But now, standing here, all the money in the world meant nothing if that girl didn't wake up. He paced the hallway, ignoring the curious glances of nurses and patients passing by. The cold hospital air smelled of antiseptic and fear. His mind replayed the accident over and over, the flash of headlights, the screech of the bus, the tiny hands pushing him out of the way. She had saved him. A complete stranger. And now she might die because of it. Minutes turned into an hour, then 2. Finally, the doctor emerged, pulling off his surgical mask. Nathan's breath caught in his throat.
She made it through the surgery, the doctor said.
Nathan felt his knees go weak. Relief slammed into him so hard he almost staggered. But, the doctor continued, his expression serious, she's far from safe. The internal bleeding was extensive. We managed to stop it, but her body is weak. Her organs are struggling. The next 24 hours will determine everything. Nathan forced himself to stay steady. Can I see her? The doctor nodded. Nathan stepped into the dimly lit IQ room. The rhythmic beeping of machines filled the silence. She looked even smaller now, swallowed by the bed, wires and tubes connected to her frail body. A ventilator helped her breathe, her chest rising and falling in slow, unsteady motions. Nathan pulled a chair beside her bed and sat down heavily. For the first time in his life, he felt helpless. He had spent years building his wealth, securing his power, yet he had never felt as desperate as he did now. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, his hands clasped together. I don't even know your name, he murmured, but I owe you everything. The girl didn't stir. He clenched his fists. I made you a promise, he continued, his voice tight. You asked me to help the other kids in the square. And I will. I swear it. His jaw tightened. But you need to stay, kid. You hear me? He exhaled shakily. You fought for me. Now fight for yourself. He sat there, unmoving, long into the night. And for the first time in years, Nathan Sterling prayed. The rhythmic beeping of the heart monitor filled the sterile hospital room, a fragile reminder that life still clung to the girl lying motionless on the bed. Nathan sat beside her, his fingers laced together, his elbows resting on his knees. The quiet hum of machines was the only sound in the room, apart from his unsteady breathing. She was still alive. But for how much longer? A nurse entered the room, checking the IV lines and adjusting the machines. Nathan barely acknowledged her presence. His gaze remained locked on the child who had saved his life, the girl whose name he still didn't know.
She's stable for now, the nurse said softly.
But her condition is critical. Nathan nodded stiffly. And what does that mean exactly? The nurse hesitated, as if choosing her words carefully. Her organs are weak. The damage from the accident was severe, and though the surgery stopped the internal bleeding, her body is struggling to recover. Nathan clenched his jaw. So, what's next? What does she need? She needs time, the nurse said, and a miracle. Nathan's gut twisted. He wasn't a man who believed in miracles. He had built his fortune on strategy and precision, not faith. But now, with the girl's life hanging by a thread, he had never felt more powerless. As the night stretched on, he refused to leave her side. Every so often, the machines would beep erratically, sending his heart into his throat. Nurses and doctors would rush in, adjusting medications, monitoring her vitals, and every time, he braced himself for the worst. She was slipping away bit by bit. At dawn, the doctor returned. Nathan stood immediately, his muscles stiff from sitting too long. There's something else, the doctor said, rubbing his tired eyes. Her kidneys are failing. Nathan's breath caught. What? She's going into renal failure, the doctor said grimly. It's likely a result of the trauma from the accident. We're doing what we can, but she won't survive without a kidney transplant. The words hit Nathan like a fist to the chest. "How soon?" he demanded. "Immediately," the doctor said. "Her body won't hold out much longer." Nathan ran a hand through his hair, his mind racing. "Then get her a kidney, whatever it takes." The doctor sighed. "It's not that simple. She has no listed relatives, no medical records. We need a donor match, and even if we put her on the transplant list, there's no guarantee we'll find one in time." Nathan's hands clenched in fists. "Then test me." The doctor blinked. "Excuse me?" "Test me," Nathan repeated, his voice unwavering. "See if I'm a match." The doctor hesitated. "Sir, the chances of you being a compatible donor?" "I don't care about the chances," Nathan cut him off. "Test me." The doctor studied him for a moment, then gave a small nod. "We'll run the tests immediately." Nathan didn't move as the doctor left the room, his heartbeat pounding in his ears. He turned back to the girl, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. "If this is what it takes," he murmured, "then I'll do it." The tests were excruciatingly slow. Nathan paced the waiting room, his patience wearing thin. Every passing second felt like a countdown to disaster. Finally, the doctor returned, a thick file in his hands. Nathan's breath caught at the expression on his face. "Well," he demanded. The doctor hesitated, then let out a breath. "You're a match." Nathan's knees nearly buckled. Relief surged through him until he saw the doctor's face harden. "There's a complication," the doctor continued. Nathan tensed. "What kind of complication?" The doctor opened the file, flipping through the pages. "Your medical tests revealed something concerning. You have an underlying heart condition." Nathan stilled.
What?
"Your heart is under significant stress," the doctor said carefully. "You may not have noticed the symptoms yet, but it's serious. If you undergo surgery to donate a kidney, there's a high risk that your heart won't withstand it." A cold chill ran down Nathan's spine. "What are you saying?" The doctor met his gaze evenly. "I'm saying that if you go through with this, you could die." Nathan let the words settle. Then, without hesitation, he said, "Schedule the surgery." The doctor's expression flickered with disbelief. "Mr. Sterling, you don't understand the risk." "No," Nathan interrupted, "you don't understand. This girl saved my life. She threw herself in front of a bus for me, a complete stranger. She didn't think about the risk. She didn't hesitate." His voice dropped lower, raw with emotion. "So why the hell would I?" The doctor exhaled sharply. "I can't stop you, but you need to think this through." Nathan didn't hesitate. "I have thought it through." The doctor studied him for a long moment, then nodded. "We'll prepare for surgery." That night, Nathan sat beside the girl once more, watching the slow rhythm of her breathing. The reality of his decision settled over him like a weight, but he felt no regret. If this was the price he had to pay, so be it. He leaned forward, his voice quiet. "You saved my life," he murmured. "Now it's my turn." Her fingers twitched slightly in response, a tiny, almost imperceptible movement. Nathan's throat tightened. "Just hold on," he whispered. "We're gonna make it." And as he sat there, the machines beeping steadily around them, Nathan Sterling prepared to give the only thing that truly mattered, his life for hers. The operating room was bathed in a cold, sterile light, the beeping of machines creating a steady rhythm that seemed to echo the fragile balance between life and death. Doctors moved with sharp precision, their hands working quickly over the small, unconscious body on the table. Amelia lay still, her chest rising and falling in slow, uneven breaths. Her tiny frame was swallowed by the surgical drapes, wires snaking around her body, the heart monitor tracing each weak beat. Across the room, Nathan was being prepped for surgery, His own body was being hooked up to machines, an IV line feeding into his arm. His heartbeat thumped steadily, perhaps for the last time. Blood pressure stable, a nurse reported. Heart rate? The lead surgeon asked. Elevated but within range. Nathan lay still, staring at the ceiling. He could feel his pulse pounding in his ears, his body heavy from the anesthesia beginning to take hold, but his mind was sharp, focused. He knew what he was doing. He turned his head slightly, glancing toward the other table where Amelia was being prepped. She looked so small, so fragile. A doctor leaned over him. "Mr. Sterling, this is your last chance to reconsider. Once we begin, there's no turning back." Nathan's fingers curled into fists. His voice was hoarse but steady. "Do it. Do it." The doctor hesitated for only a second before nodding. "Scalpel," he ordered. The surgery began. The air in the operating room was thick with tension. The lead surgeon made the first incision, his hands steady as he worked through layers of muscle and tissue. Blood pooled but was quickly absorbed by the suction tube. Nathan's heartbeat remained stable, for now. "Keep an eye on his vitals," the anesthetist warned. "He's at risk for cardiac distress." The surgeons worked quickly. The kidney was being carefully extracted from Nathan's body, each movement precise. Suddenly, the heart monitor spiked. "His heart rate is increasing," a nurse reported. Nathan's breathing grew shallow, his chest rising and falling at an uneven pace. The anesthetist frowned, his heart straining. "We need to stabilize him." "Not yet," the lead surgeon said firmly. "We're almost there." Across the room, Amelia's team was waiting, ready to receive the kidney and transplant it into her failing body. Every second counted. "We need the organ now," one of the surgeons at Amelia's table shouted. Nathan's lead surgeon made the final cut. "We have it," he announced. Carefully, he passed the kidney to the transplant team. As soon as the transfer was complete, Amelia's surgeons sprang into action. They moved fast, connecting the kidney to her tiny body, sewing blood vessels together with microscopic precision. Nathan's team turned their attention back to their patient, but something was wrong. The heart monitor's beeping became erratic, his pressures dropping. "His heart isn't handling the stress," the anesthetist warned. Nathan's fingers twitched. He could feel the weight pressing down on his chest, like something was squeezing the air from his lungs. His vision blurred at the edges, darkness creeping in. A deep, sharp pain stabbed through him. Then the monitor flatlined. "He's in cardiac arrest." Chaos erupted. "Charge the defibrillator." "Clear, clear." A shock jolted Nathan's body. His back arched violently before slamming down onto the table. Still no response. Again. Another shock. Nothing. "Come on, Sterling," the doctor muttered, his jaw clenched. "Not like this." They shocked him again. A weak beep flickered on the monitor. Then another. A nurse exhaled sharply. "He's back, but his heart is struggling." The anesthetist checked the machines. "He's not out of danger yet." Meanwhile, at the other table, Amelia's heart monitor beeped steadily.
"Her body is accepting the kidney," her surgeon reported.
The relief was palpable, but short-lived. Amelia's monitor suddenly spiked. "She's going into shock." The doctors worked frantically to stabilize her. Her small body trembled, her fragile heart fighting against the trauma of the transplant. "She's rejecting it," a nurse shouted. "Give her another dose of anti-rejection meds." Nathan's team continued working to keep him alive, but his heart was faltering. The doctor overseeing him shook his head grimly. "We can't keep him stable much longer." The two operating rooms seemed to mirror each other. Two patients. Two lives hanging by a thread. And then, Amelia's monitor let out a single, steady beep. Then another. Then another. Her breathing stabilized. "She's pulling through," the surgeon breathed. Across the room, Nathan's doctor wiped sweat from his brow.
"We need to get him to the IQ now. If his heart gives out again..."
The machines around Nathan suddenly blared. "He's crashing again." A nurse paled. "I think he's not gonna make it." The doctor gritted his teeth. "We don't stop. Not yet." Nathan's pulse was a whisper, the last ember of a dying fire. And then, the monitor flatlined once more. The operating room was suffocatingly silent. The only sound was the continuous, merciless drone of Nathan Sterling's flatline. The lead surgeon's jaw clenched, his gloved hands, slick with sweat and blood, pressed against Nathan's chest, performing compressions with desperate precision. "Again," he barked. A nurse activated the defibrillator, pressing the paddles to Nathan's bare chest. "Clear, clear." A violent jolt coursed through his body, but the heart monitor remained unchanged. "Come on, Sterling," the surgeon muttered under his breath, his voice tight with frustration. "Not like this." Another shock, another failed heartbeat. A grim hush fell over the team. The anesthetist exhaled shakily. "Doctor, we need to call it." The surgeon's hands froze mid-compression. "No, not yet." This man had given everything to save a little girl's life, a child who had thrown herself in front of a bus for him. He deserved more than this. A nurse hesitated, then murmured, "Time of death." The doctor didn't answer. Instead, he pressed his hands down against Nathan's chest and began compressions again. The team exchanged uncertain glances. "Doctor, doctor." "I'm not giving up," the surgeon growled, his face dark with defiance. His hands pressed down, counting out each compression with steady determination. Sweat dripped down his brow, but he didn't stop. "Not yet." He pressed harder, his voice a whisper now. "You don't get to die, Sterling." The beeping was gone. The monitor was still flat. The doctor squeezed his eyes shut. "Come on, damn it. Fight." One beat. Then another. A slow, faint blip appeared on the screen. The room collectively held its breath. Another beat. Then another. The beeping grew stronger, steadying to a fragile but unmistakable rhythm. "He's back," a nurse whispered in disbelief. The doctor exhaled sharply, his arms shaking from exertion. He pulled away, his chest rising and falling with exhaustion. "Get him to the IQ," he ordered, his voice hoarse. The team moved instantly, stabilizing Nathan, hooking up fresh IVs, securing oxygen. The surgeon sat back, his heartbeat matching the rhythm of the revived man before him. A miracle. Hours passed. Nathan's body lay still, his skin pale against the stark hospital sheets. His heartbeat, though weak, was steady. Outside his room, the doctors whispered about the impossible. A man who should have died. A girl who should not have survived. And yet, against all odds, both still clung to life. The morning light filtered through the blinds when Amelia finally opened her eyes. Her head felt heavy, her limbs sluggish. She blinked, her vision adjusting to the sterile white of the hospital room. The steady beep of the machines greeted her like a distant lullaby. She was alive. Her fingers twitched, reaching toward her stomach, where she knew something had changed. She didn't understand the medical details, but she could feel it. Something foreign, something new, keeping her alive. Then the memories crashed into her. The restaurant, the accident, Nathan. Nathan. Her breath hitched. "Yes, sir," she croaked weakly. The nurse at her bedside turned, relief flashing across her face. "You're awake!" Amelia ignored her, trying to sit up. Her muscles screamed in protest. Where is he?" she asked, her voice raw. The nurse hesitated. "You need to rest, sweetheart," she soothed. Amelia's chest tightened. "No, please, tell me." The nurse sighed, then nodded toward the room across the hall. Amelia's eyes followed. Her heart dropped. Nathan's room was dimly lit, but she could see the outline of his still body, the wires, the machines keeping him alive.
He wasn't awake.
Her throat burned. No, hey. "He's alive," the nurse interrupted gently, "but he hasn't woken up yet." A choked breath escaped Amelia's lips. "Alive."
She wasn't sure if it was relief or something heavier pressing against her chest.
"He gave you his kidney, Amelia," the nurse continued softly, "even when he knew the risks." Tears burned at the edges of her eyes.
He almost died, Amelia whispered.
The nurse gave a sad nod. Amelia's fingers curled into the hospital sheets. "No, this wasn't how it was supposed to happen. She hadn't wanted this. She just wanted to help the others, the kids in the square. She wanted a single piece of bread, not a man's life in exchange for her own." Her lips trembled. And yet, he had done it anyway. The first time Amelia was wheeled into Nathan's room, she barely had the strength to keep her head up. The doctors had been hesitant, but she refused to rest until she saw him. He looked different. Weaker. The powerful man she had seen that night in the square was gone, replaced by someone pale and fragile. The machines around him beeped softly, their steady rhythm an unspoken battle cry. Amelia swallowed past the lump in her throat. You can't leave," she whispered, her small fingers reaching for his hand.
His skin was cold.
She tightened her grip. "You have to wake up," she pleaded. I can't do this without you."
She leaned closer, her voice barely above a breath.
"I never wanted you to do this for me," she whispered. "I just wanted you to help the others. That's all I ever wanted." Tears slipped down her cheeks. "But you gave me your life."
She let out a shuddering breath.
"I won't let it be for nothing." Her fingers squeezed his weakly, her fragile body trembling with exhaustion. "Please come back." She closed her eyes, her forehead resting against his hand. And in the stillness, in the quiet hum of machines, Nathan's fingers twitched. A soft beep broke the silence. Then another. Nathan's fingers twitched beneath Amelia's weak grasp, and her breath caught. She pulled back slightly, eyes wide, heart hammering in her chest. Had she imagined it? But then his eyelids fluttered. His chest rose in a deeper, less mechanical breath. The machines continued their rhythmic beeping, but now they were joined by something new. Life. Nathan Sterling was waking up. Amelia's trembling fingers gripped his hand tighter. "Sir," she whispered, barely daring to hope. His breathing changed, shifting from shallow and forced to something steadier, something real. Then, finally, his eyes cracked open. The harsh fluorescent light made him squint, and for a moment he was lost. His mind sluggish, his body aching beyond belief. Everything hurt. His chest, his ribs, his limbs felt too heavy, his heart too slow. But then his gaze focused. And the first thing he saw was her. A small, fragile girl with wide, tear-filled eyes staring at him like he was the most important thing in the world. His lips parted, his voice barely a whisper. "You made it." Amelia let out a choked laugh, the tears finally slipping down her face. "You made it too," she whispered back. Nathan blinked slowly, exhaustion dragging at him. His memories were hazy, but pieces floated back to him. The accident. The hospital. The transplant. His heart had failed. He should have died. But he hadn't. He was still here. He exhaled shakily, feeling the weight of his body, the ache deep in his bones. You gave me your kidney," Amelia murmured, her voice laced with guilt, "even when they told you it could kill you." Nathan's lips quirked into the barest hint of a smile. "Seemed like a fair trade." A sob slipped past Amelia's lips, and she quickly wiped her eyes with the sleeve of her hospital gown. "You're an idiot," she whispered. Nathan let out a breathy chuckle. "I've been called worse." For a long moment, they simply stared at each other. The powerful businessman and the invisible street girl, bound together by a single impossible moment. Then Amelia's expression hardened. "You have to rest," she said firmly, sniffing back her emotions. "You're not allowed to die. Not after all this." Nathan huffed a weak laugh, shifting slightly in the bed. The effort sent a sharp pain through his chest, and he winced. "Not planning on it," he murmured. Amelia nodded, her fingers still wrapped around his, as if letting go would make him disappear. "I'm gonna make sure it wasn't for nothing," she said softly. Nathan's gaze sharpened slightly. "What do you mean?" She swallowed hard. "You promised me something before the ambulance. You said you'd help the kids in the square." Nathan was silent for a long moment, then exhaled deeply. "I did." "And you meant it?" she asked, searching his tired face. His expression softened. "Yeah, kid," he whispered. "I meant it." Something in Amelia's chest unknotted. For the first time in her life, she believed in someone's word. She squeezed his hand once, then let go. "You get some rest, sir," she whispered, "because when you wake up, we have a lot of work to do." Recovery was slow. Nathan spent weeks in the hospital, regaining his strength, relearning how to move without feeling like his body was made of lead. Amelia, too, was fragile, but her recovery was smoother, her body accepting the new kidney with little resistance. Every day, she visited him.
She brought stories about the nurses, updates on the kids she used to share the streets with, bits of hope in a world that still felt too cruel.
And Nathan, for the first time in his life, listened. Not out of obligation, not because it benefited him, but because he wanted to. One afternoon, as he sat up for the first time without feeling like collapsing, he looked at her with something close to determination. "We're doing it," he said. Amelia frowned. "Doing what?" Nathan took a slow breath. "The center," he said, "for the kids." Her eyes widened. You mean it?" "Yeah," he said simply. "I don't break promises, kid." Her lips trembled, and for a moment she looked like she wanted to cry. Instead, she straightened her spine, nodding sharply. "Then we better start planning." Months passed. The world moved on. But for Nathan Sterling, nothing was the same. His office, once filled with cold transactions and ruthless decisions, now had blueprints spread across his desk. Designs, plans. For a new building. A home. Not for profit. Not for power. For them. The kids in the square, the forgotten ones. And standing beside him, Guiding him through the vision was Amelia.
She had refused to be left out.
This isn't just yours, she had told him one day, hands on her hips. And he had only nodded. She was right. They had built this together. The grand opening of the Haven was unlike anything Nathan had ever done before. The press swarmed, eager for a headline. A billionaire's redemption story. The orphan who changed a tycoon's heart. But none of that mattered. Not really. What mattered was the kids running through the halls, their laughter echoing against the walls. What mattered was the hot meals being served, the warm beds being filled, the lives being changed. What mattered was the girl standing beside him, looking at the place like it was a dream come to life. You did it, Amelia whispered. Nathan glanced down at her. We did it, he wanted to say. Instead, he just smiled. And for the first time in his life, Nathan Sterling felt truly rich. Thank you for staying until the very end of this story. It means more than you know. This is not just a story about a billionaire and a little girl. It's a story about second chances, about kindness in a world that too often looks away. Amelia was invisible to society, yet she gave everything to save a stranger. Nathan had everything money could buy, yet he was lost, until a single act of selflessness changed his life forever. This story teaches us that true wealth isn't found in bank accounts, but in the lives we touch. That no matter where we come from, no matter what we've lost, we always have the power to give. And sometimes it is in saving others that we find the courage to save ourselves. Where are you watching from? Let me know in the comments. I'd love to hear from you. If this story moved you, don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you never miss another video. More stories are coming. Stories are coming, stories that remind us of the strength of the human heart and the miracles that happen when we choose to care. Thank you again for being here. Until next time, stay kind, stay hopeful, and never stop believing in the power of compassion.